Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. Wanted to, just thank you for joining us on a Wednesday evening, and welcome to the webinar on Futures Literacy for Peacebuilding. I am joined today by Moe and Natsuha, who will be introducing themselves to you very shortly, but I just want to set some context just as we begin. So in this episode of the Transforming the Future webinar, we wanted to spotlight two facilitators that are joining us from a project that UNESCO has been running with UNDPPA, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, called Futuring Peace in Northeast Asia. It is a series of virtual dialogues with young people from Northeast Asia to be able to share their thoughts on the future and to spotlight their diverse voices. This project was initiated by DPPA through design policy inputs, and UNESCO has been partnered in infusing these dialogues with Futures Literacy, which we will refer to as FL, to be infused with FL. So I'll just go over quickly what Futures Literacy is, what are FLLs for those who are joining us for the first time, and then hand it over to Moe and Natsuha, who will introduce themselves. Futures Literacy is a capability. It is the skill that anyone can and should acquire, which allows us to better understand how it is that we are using the future and the present. What are these lenses that we see the future through to become better able to understand, to discern our anticipatory assumptions. The process by which Futures Literacy is often introduced to different participants or folks for the first time is through Futures Literacy Laboratories. So these are on the ground action learning participatory processes where we invite participants to share what they know about the future and to begin equally in exploring a journey together. It is typically we take people through 4 different phases. The phase 1 being reveal, so rendering the tacit to become explicit. The way I often like to explain it is that you're sort of drawing out your box before you think outside of the box, which is phase 2. But for phase 1, we often ask people to share with us their probable future in a given timeline, and then also their preferable futures. So what do they think is the most likely future and what they also perceive to be their most desirable, most ideal future. In phase 2, we do what is called a reframe. This reframe draws on the anticipatory assumptions, which are images where we source inspiration from to create different images of the future that we have, different lenses from our background, experiences, and so on and so forth. We take these anticipatory assumptions that people share with us in phase 1, the probable and preferred. We put a spin on it, make it bizarre, make it strange, and introduce a scenario that is tailored to whoever is joining us for that lab or for an FL infused process, to give them a space to play in, to see different possibilities that are neither probable nor desirable. Following this, we have time in phase 3 and phase 4, which we call new questions and next steps, which are custom designed and tailored to the group that we are running this Futures Literacy Laboratory with. And new questions allows participants to come back into the present to compare their probable, preferred, and reframe futures that we explore together to see what new learnings have emerged for them. And next steps will depend on what our specific partner is looking to do or to have as an output. So again, for context, Moe and Natsuha are joining us from the Futuring Peace Project, which was initiated by DPPA, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. And so one of the key outputs was to have visions of the future that were described by young people as to serve as inputs for policymaking or to inspire different policymaking. So as this is for US context, you can also visit futuringpeace.org to see more information on this specific projects or other exciting initiatives by our colleagues at DPPA. So again, that's futuringpeace.org. Though in the meantime, I would like to pass this over to Moe and Natsuha to introduce themselves. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sally. Hi, everyone. I'm Natsuha, and I was a group lead facilitator and also a co-designer in the project that Sally just mentioned, Futuring Peace in Northeast Asia. So I have a background in primary school education as well as language education, and I worked as a Japanese language teacher, and I have been involved in peace building projects as a coordinator and also as a workshop facilitator. And I am currently a master's student in the University of Oulu in Finland in education and globalization. And my interest lies widely in education for peace building and social justice. And my current research topic is potentials in education for peace building, especially in the context of Northeast Asia. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Natsuha. My name is Moe Sasaki, and I was also one of the lead facilitators and co-designers in the Futuring Peace in Northeast Asia project. I am working as a facilitator and coordinator for active citizenship and conflict transformation projects, and recently focusing on youth inclusion efforts for peace building at all levels of peace building, focusing especially in the Northeast Asia and East Africa context. I recently completed my master's in SOAS University in London, focusing on violence, conflict, and development. And I researched about the role of collective memory and everyday resistance in post-conflict Rwanda and its role in reconciliation there. For the past 7 years, I've worked with NGOs and international organizations and in the private sector to equip and empower citizens and young people so that they can be better agents of change. And recently have been working to try and connect that work with also affecting policy change. And so this project that we were all a part of was kind of an interesting experience where all of these things kind of connected together. I think now that we've introduced ourselves, we can perhaps move on to giving a little more context about the program that we experienced, kind of describing how we went through the process that Sally shared with us just now. Clara or Sally, perhaps we can share the little slide to help us. Or if not, we can just share verbally.
Give me 1 minute. I will have it up in a second.
Thank you. Maybe we can start sharing as we get the slides up. Natsuha, do you want to start us off?
Yeah. So Futuring Peace in Northeast Asia. So we had a set of 3 Futures dialogues, the first one in July and then the second and third in October. So in the preparation of these dialogue sessions, a group of people who are from the region made up the co-design group for this process, including ourselves. And the co-designers, including ourselves, were trained in futures literacy. Then we designed the dialogues and invited youth participants from the region to a participatory process of exploring different futures of the role of youth for regional peace building in Northeast Asia together. And passing on to Moe.
Yes, and so all efforts to know the future are rooted in anticipation, which was a consideration that was quite new to us, to myself and Natsuha, and especially participants. And these ways of using anticipation are usually with a goal in mind. And in addition to that, people tend to use the future in different ways and for different reasons that are specific to the local context. So what Futures Literacy training taught us was to use anticipation without a set image of the future, which is to explore how we could use the future for the present without any preset assumptions in mind. So this deconstructing of and reimagining of our anticipated futures was encouraged through a reframe where we entered a strange and bizarre future, what Sally was talking about. And so in light of some assumptions and anticipations that we found through the dialogue between youth, we set a few parameters to consider the futures of 2060. So this was kind of a reframe that was made for us as participants specifically. So we imagined futures where the only constant was our responsibility for future generations and also climate change. And so through initial dialogues, especially through our discussions of our probable and preferred futures, we realized that youth were often bound with a responsibility to act in accordance with expectations that we felt from our elders, like our parents, grandparents, and the seniors we have around us. So we wanted to kind of flip that on its head. And perhaps this sense of being, having to respond to the expectations of our elders is perhaps quite heavy for the Northeast Asian context. And another assumption that we found was that climate conditions would continue to decline, but the rapidity of it, or the kind of concept of change as a constant was still something that we needed to grapple with. So we decided to put that within the reframe as well.
Thank you, Moe. So as Moe just mentioned, through this reframe and setting an environment of dialogue, we got to test some of the assumptions that we use when we imagine the futures and to see if these assumptions remained prevalent or if they changed, and got a chance to clarify whether things that were important to us remained important, and to understand more precisely why such things are valuable to us when imagining the futures of our region as youth. So with regards to these different images of the futures, probable, preferred, and reframed, we had the potential for generating what the future of peace can and even should look like, and the many possibilities youth have in 2060. So the outcomes of the dialogue served as an inspiration for policy making and to build creative tools for policy communication.
Thanks, Natsuha. Thanks, Moe, for the wonderful context. And actually, I just realized that I haven't actually introduced myself on this webinar. So very quickly, I'm from the UNESCO Futures Literacy team, and I am an FL designer as well as facilitator. So I have had the wonderful pleasure of working very closely with Moe and Natsuha and other talented young women from the Northeast Asian region who are also co-designers and facilitators throughout this process. And of course, along with our DPPA colleagues. To add to what Moe and Natsuha said, there were a number of different interesting insights that came out of the dialogue, in addition to the ones that they just mentioned. There was a changed understanding of education, and instead the emphasis was perhaps rather placed on learning. And throughout the discussion around intergenerationality and how the younger generation interacts with the old, the participants, the young people, came to this realization that learning is something that can be two-directional. It's not just young people being expected to learn from the older generations, but that they could potentially each teach each other different ideas, but that also learning was not something that was a uniquely a young person's task, but that anyone at any age could actually go back to school courses or just in a learning environment to be exposed to new things. Climate change, as it was already mentioned, actually came up as a topic that was more important than they had thought it was prior to the dialogue, which actually links to the theme of intergenerational relations, realizing that this is an intergenerational issue. And so the roles that different generations come together to play in solving climate change or in facing it really would be different and would need to be negotiated in a way. New technology came up quite often throughout the discussions. And so one was that new technology was being seen as a way to bridge gaps between urban and rural areas in order to be used in service of education and learning. But of course, the participants were wary of its consequences in that not having access to the digital can actually exacerbate existing gaps and inequalities. The other way that new technology was being used was tied again to intergenerational relations, in that some felt a burden to care for an aging population, but saw that if technology can take on much of the work in manual care, it transforms the meaning of being responsible to care for our older generations, and it allowed the meaning to change in the sense that it was not seen as a burden any longer, but then would free up young people to have times to spend with with older folks that they knew, to be able to have quality time together, to have enjoyment in spending time together, and not being only seen as a duty or burden. So it spoke to different assumptions that they made, as well as different realizations that came up throughout the dialogue. One thing that was quite clear was their willingness to engage in difference, and not so much seeing it as a bad thing, but something that actually contributed to a diversity of ideas, and also a stronger sense of agency that came out of the dialogue as well. So with this bit of context in mind, for the rest of the webinar, we have a few questions that we have for Moe and Natsuha. And at the end of this, we will also take us through a 30-minute or so question and answer period. And so even if any of you that are joining in currently just have a question for us, feel free to just type it and drop it into the chat, and we'll come back and revisit those. You're also welcome to save your questions for the end, and then just raise your hand and be able to just unmute and ask as well. So let us move ahead. This was actually for Moe and Natsuha, this is your first time experiencing Futures Literacy and your first time facilitating as well. I'd like to ask, how was the experience for you in context of Northeast Asia, tackling the topic of youth roles in the future of Northeast Asian peace?
May I answer first? Okay, so for myself, especially as an educator and a student interested in education for peace building, I had a very refreshing experience and gained new perspectives through imagining the futures collaboratively and creatively. So imagining 2060 using the present tense itself was something that I had personally never done before. And the process such as using the causal layered analysis, breaking it down to headlines, actors, systems, and myth metaphors brought us an opportunity to dive into what we could really imagine in detail in the process. So thinking about probable and preferred futures separately in the first dialogue and noticing the differences in comparison was also a new learning experience to see my own and other participants' anticipations, including finding the commonalities and differences among the ideas. So the main themes that came up in the dialogue also include intergenerational cooperation and conflict, lifelong learning in the aging Northeast Asian region, and youth participation in politics, concept of value and wealth in connection to environmental issues, and regionality of Northeast Asia. So for example, for the regionality of Northeast Asia especially, we saw different views for the future. Some foresee increased conflicts, while others imagine the region less defined by traditional or national identities without having borders or going beyond borders, working together more cooperatively, incorporating, for example, common textbooks and transnational curriculum in the school context. So this gave me inspiration to work on the research with questions such as, what are the boundaries of regional collaboration? And if there's a tension between national and regional identities, how can we address that while at the same time challenging prejudice across groups? So it was a refreshing and inspiring experience for myself personally, as well as for my studies and research.
Thanks, Natsuha. For my part, I think going into this project, I went in from a perspective of a peace building dialogue facilitator and trainer. So the process itself was really interesting. So kind of as a peace building dialogue facilitator in Northeast Asia, I had experiences of creating environments where participants from the region could better understand each other, understand each other's positionalities, and also collaboratively imagine what peace and peaceful futures can look like. But this kind of systematic process that Futures Literacy provided, where we could look at anticipation, was completely new to me. So I really appreciated the agency building process of Futures Literacy. And I really enjoyed how the participants themselves were given a methodology to compare each other's assumptions and anticipations and question what it means to deconstruct them within the understanding that no one has the right answer. This kind of very equal playing field that the experience kind of showed me is interesting, especially in the light that in the context of Northeast Asian peace building, there's a sense of power relation between elders and younger people going into the peace building field. We'll kind of touch on this a little more later, I think, but as a young person going into the field of peace building in Northeast Asia, history and the past and doing right in light of the past is quite an important but heavy burden that we carry perhaps as peace builders. And it's perhaps something we especially feel as young peace builders. I recently read a little article that was actually written by my little brother, and he was talking about the concept of a haunting and how social injustice often comes to us as a haunting from the past, to call us to kind of realize that things are not as they seem, that things are not perhaps going as smoothly as we think, and that we're called or haunted to act in reaction to this. And I thought this word haunting was really interesting because it does kind of have that sense of gravity and fear that we feel perhaps as young peace builders going into this field. So in kind of contrast to that, the Futures Literacy process was a somewhat liberating process because we got to look at the future instead of always kind of focusing on the past and past conflict of the region. So those were kind of the first sense of the experience that I had of Futures Literacy. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both. That is super rich to hear, both in terms of the inspiration that you were able to source from the discussions with participants to have new questions of your own, to advance your own research or to help you conceptualize what kinds of other questions you would ask, but also in terms of relating it to not only our everyday life, but the way having this diversity of perspectives changes the way we might walk on the street, move through day-to-day life, and also consider, quite importantly, our past also. And this is quite interesting in that in different futures processes, the past tends to come up a lot more often than we think. And in a way, it's nice to hear that it's given you a chance to reflect on your own relationship, not only to the future, but also reassess your relationship to the past as well. So that's super neat. And thank you for sharing. I'm also curious to hear if you found any challenges as you move through the FL approach. So context for the audience that is with us today. The way we learn and cultivate futures literacy is about making explicit how we consciously anticipate the future. And when we are first encountered with some of our anticipatory assumptions, it can be kind of tricky because we haven't consciously thought about it before. And also when we're encountered with different ideas from different participants, that also may raise difference for us, and we might not be sure of how to react to it. Of course, this is on the sort of learning side of becoming familiar with futures literacy, but there may also be logistical challenges, just as with organizing an event for 50 plus young people from multiple different countries in the Northeast Asian region. So curious to hear from you if any of those challenges existed for you.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, definitely. It was, there's a lot of challenges, especially being a first-time facilitator, kind of working with this diverse group of people, using online platforms that ensured that, for example, Chinese participants could join. So a lot of kind of logistical challenges. But I think I want to focus on the challenge I felt, I guess, of creating a space where we can create collective knowledge or collective knowledge building, I guess. And I think one of the big challenges we had, particularly for this topic, I assume, is that we had a lot of big topics, right? So just looking at the title, we talked about peace, which in itself is a big topic that we can talk about for days. We talked about youth and kind of understanding what youth is from each of our different perspectives and countries, trying to understand what Northeast Asia is. It's often a term that you don't see outside of maybe policy fields. And so it was quite a new terminology for a lot of the participants as well. So I think tackling each of these big topics together was quite a challenge because these are highly contextual topics as well. So as a facilitator, to be able to kind of pick up on each of these topics separately, but also as a big topic of the future of peace in Northeast Asia and the role of youth within it, was quite a challenge, I think. But also quite a rewarding experience of being able to really think about each of these topics separately and together, and really starting to question each other, what our assumptions were based on these different topics that we had. As a facilitator, I think another big challenge was trying to ask the questions that would allow participants to make their own sense of the insights that were being shared. I think for our members, there were some of us who were more used to futures literacy and facilitating it. And we also had more like policy foresight specialists. And so for perhaps more of our literate or more practiced facilitators and members, we could really see that there was so much insight being shared by the youth participants. But then being able to have that same level of that aha moment was quite a challenge as a facilitator. So I think as a first-time facilitator, the challenge I had was to try and guide participants to see the insights that were being shared without allowing my own kind of limited capabilities to get in the way of the knowledge that was being shared, and giving space for participants to make those connections and kind of take ownership of the process as well. I guess, I think this sticks with me a lot because as a kind of dialogue facilitator in the context of Northeast Asia peace building, creating a space where everyone has equal power and equal kind of sharing ability to share their knowledge and share their perspectives is really a big part of peace building itself. And so I was really looking at the FL process itself as a peace building process, right? Not just the outcomes or the insights. And so I think as a facilitator, that was one of the big challenges that I kind of went in with, of how to make the process itself a peace building process. Natsuha, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Moe, for sharing. So as you mentioned, Moe, participants met each other for the first time, right? And then we started the process of Futures dialogues right away. So adding on to what was shared already, while it was such an exciting and a rewriting process, in a sense that we could share different imagination of futures with people you just met only based on the common interests and keywords such as peace and youth in the region of Northeast Asia. It was also very challenging to dive into the topics together immediately, I feel. So I felt that the thinking process required a good amount of time so participants could contemplate, also myself as well, the ideas of the futures. So we have talked about this a lot, why it was quite difficult after the dialogue as well, together with Moe and with other co-designers as well. So we can imagine and consider that this difficulty may be coming from, for example, youth in Northeast Asia might not be very used to talking about the issues of the region, even of the present or the past, in a multinational group of people, let alone about the future. And also in Futures literacy, sometimes spontaneous, quick, and creative imagination is required, while for youth in Northeast Asia, it may not be very easy to think outside of the box immediately, or they may be a general hesitance for sharing ideas or making a statement. I will also talk about this in connection to education later. But also in addition to this, in the imagination of futures, a wide variety of ideas came up and that don't have direct connection necessarily with each other. So as a facilitator, it was quite challenging to let participants connect ideas or go in depth in ideas in the limited time frame, I felt as well. So I realized the importance of futures literacy taking an uncertain and unfamiliar process where participants are invited to creatively imagine and describe the futures, as the goal is to go beyond what is immediately known or understood to examine how we come to have the knowledge or understand them in particular ways. So considering that, and to make the most of the given time, perhaps we could acknowledge that it might be helpful when implementing futures literacy in the context of Northeast Asia for the facilitators and perhaps also for the participants to get better understanding of the positionalities and perhaps background as well of the participants and also ourselves as facilitators going into dialogues, so that we could further understand assumptions and where they could be stemming from. So it could help us to generate and ask meaningful questions to support the participants' exploration of futures and get deeper understanding and make it more meaningful experience as a whole. But then at the same time, we wonder, as well, it raises a question if it is possible or encouraged that people know themselves prior to a dialogue, or is the dialogue process itself necessary to be based on that we don't really know ourselves or our positionality? So can learning about ourselves and exploring futures be simultaneous? This also speaks to the ideal futures literacy process and the real limitations that we face when running this program within given times and platform as well.
Thank you both. Wow, that is just super rich reflection. And that's why I was counting the times that you said at the same time and just thinking about how many things that were simultaneously stacked on top of each other in terms of tasks when we're facilitators. Especially as facilitators who are learning FL as you go. The team is quite big on this in terms of taking a learning by doing process, and pleased to hear from both of you that you really managed to roll with it and to be able to reflect on these challenges, despite them being sometimes, well, challenging, since we're using this word. But also speaks to sort of this dual task, right? Not only learning FL on your own, but also trying to see through the FL lens and to point it out to participants. There's sort of a way of saying like the best way to learn something is to teach it, because to be able to teach it, you have to have a really strong grasp of it yourself. And so it was really interesting to hear how you both navigated this. On facilitation and drawing connections between what people are saying. That I think is a super difficult skill as a facilitator to be able to grasp and hone and to sharpen and become good at it. I think everyone in the audience who actually ever tried facilitating anything will actually share in this experience with you, and that's always tricky to make these linkages, especially as the dialogue is on the go. So super interesting, and thank you both to hear it. I'm also curious to actually expand on this a little bit further. If you had like one wish in terms of either making the process more participatory or in terms of, pushing yourself further as a facilitator, what would that be? So one wish.
That's a hard question. To push myself as a facilitator, I think this is a really simple one, but I think one that often is always more needed in these kind of processes is more patience on my side, more patience to wait for the insights to come, and for sometimes allowing participants to take the lead here and there during the dialogue process, and trusting the process, right? We were told over and over, trust the process, but sometimes maybe the hardest, the person that finds that the hardest is the facilitator themselves. So I think for FL, but also as a facilitator in general, having more patience would be a wonderful thing.
Yeah, thanks, Moe. Also, in connection to what you just said, I feel like more trusted relationship between the facilitators ourselves, like trust in myself as a facilitator also, but then also trust with the relationship with the participants too, like also in the co-designing teams as well. And like Moe said, also trust in the process too, so that we can have more participatory, as we have shared before, process that everyone can join for the knowledge creation together, and feel free to be able to share their own ideas more freely and more confidently as well. So yeah, more trust for the trusted atmosphere and the relationships.
Super interesting. Thank you both. I really like that you sort of both emphasize trust. It's sort of one of those foundational pieces, like if we're thinking about building something, it's one of those foundational building blocks to creating spaces, whether virtually or in person, that are conducive to dialogue. And we often might think this is, sort of easy to come by, just say, hey, don't worry, let's just dive in. But actually, all of these sort of nuanced and minuscule reactions that we have as a facilitator to a comment, all adds to shaping the environment in a way that allows people to feel like, hey, I can be vulnerable here. I can, in fact, open up and actually speak my mind in order to truly dive into these topics with you, which can at times be very personal, but when discussed together do have broader implications for society around us. So super neat that this was flagged. The next question I have for you is on connecting FL and this experience that you've had to other areas of work that you have or other areas of your involvement. What are opportunities that you have found through the FL approach? How do you, if at all, see FL being incorporated in your work outside of this particular project? Or how does it connect to your own research and practice? I heard earlier, Natsuha, that this was inspiring you with some research questions. For Mo and Natsuha, please, I'd love to have the two of you elaborate.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. We both kind of got together and tried to think of how we can further our learning and kind of the capabilities we built through the Futures Literacy Lab, but also through facilitating. And myself and Natsuha also worked together in kind of creating spaces for dialogue within Northeast Asia, and separate from this project. So we're kind of excited to see how we can incorporate parts of FL into our dialogue as well. So we kind of wanted to speak on that, as well as how we wanted to put it into our respective fields of practice. But as we talked, there were several key aspects of FL that we found really fascinating. Some of the things I think can touch on today is the kind of shift in power that we felt through this process in the context of Northeast Asia youth and peace building. So power was one big thing. Another that we talked about was the sense of burden that we feel as young peace builders. Perhaps we can speak mostly about in Japan, but also wider in the region. So the sense of burden as peace builders in the region, right? And another aspect that we appreciated and found valuable through the FL was the direction that we saw through the dialogue that FL provided. We definitely felt the power of kind of the researched and scientific methodology that sometimes is lacking in kind of peace building dialogues. So we really kind of liked the methodology and process that FL provided. And finally, kind of going through this whole process, we perceived that participants experienced a sense of discomfort, which at the time sometimes felt unsettling. But after kind of talking together and with other facilitators, we also saw it as a key opportunity for change and action. And this kind of discomfort, I guess, is also what got myself and Natsuha talking about how we can continue to tackle this discomfort that we had. What does it mean? How can we kind of answer to this discomfort outside of the project that we were both a part of? So we'll kind of speak to these different keywords that I just shared, and then expand a little bit about how we think we can answer to these topics through the work that we do separately, but also together. Yeah, Natsuha, do you want to get us going with the first topic of burden?
Yes, sure. So I would like to first introduce and talk about burden and power together. So when focusing on the past, there is a hierarchy of knowledge, and this becomes almost a bodily experience when tackling the topics of peace and conflict in Northeast Asia. So these are very important themes together. So in the context of Northeast Asia, and perhaps specifically for myself and Moe as someone who have Japanese background, we have a sense that our elders are the ones who have a stronger and rightful sense of ownership of past conflict in our region. So in Japan, our dominant history often speaks of peace and war in terms of the Second World War and the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, and the effort our elders have maintained in protecting, for example, Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution that prohibits the Japanese state from having a military. But there is a sense of perhaps holiness about the experiences of our elders. So perhaps this is especially a keen sensibility in the context of Northeast Asia, where culturally we are to respect our elders as well. So this sense of respect and upholding our elders is a precious aspect of our region and its culture, but it does come with a sense of power that can bind us as young people in how we take part in peace and peace building. So there is also a sense of preservation of how and what to remember about past conflict, which has arguably kept the agenda of peace quite narrow in the context of especially Japan, making more recent and wider issues of peace and conflict that are happening right now a non-peace and conflict issue. So this maintains a sense that there is a knower and the learner, which may be part of what keeps young people from feeling worthy of tackling peace and conflict issues in our region. And there's a lot of energy and due diligence that is necessary to talk about our past conflict and therefore the future of peace. So also, especially as youth having a Japanese background, to discuss peace with participants from Korea and China and also multiple nations and countries and areas can be tricky as we carry a history conflict together. So we, in a sense, carry the baggage of needing to represent correctly without having experienced war as young people, which often keeps young people from tackling these issues, we feel. But yeah, Moe, do you want to continue with power?
Yes, so I think Natsuha kind of shared the respect that we have of the experiences of our elders, while also that being in a sense a burden, and that we feel as youth, creating a sense of power relation between who can speak about peace and who cannot speak so easily about peace, right? So this context often places us as young people in a situation where we feel we do not have the power to talk about peace in the region. Perhaps this is a little bit simplified when I put it like this, but there is that kind of, yeah, Natana, we're talking about this, but there is a bit of fear that or trepidation that we have when we go into this topic of, do we know the information enough? Are we making sure that we're not stepping on anyone's feet? But what thinking about the future allowed us to do was to, in a sense, lighten, for the lack of a better term, the burden of being youth in this context, and to ideate beyond the somewhat narrow agenda of peace that we often find ourselves in. So it empowered us to imagine or reimagine the agenda of peace that that is often set out for us. And this kind of allowed us to include things like peace with nature, with diversity, the acceptance of different gender identities, and kind of ways of living in general that in more traditional perspectives of peace would not be on the agenda. So it touched on the social issues that young people experienced in their current life more directly. But within this, what might be worth noting through the Futures Literacy kind of process was that despite our reframe being our responsibility to future generations, the way we imagine the future still kept our responsibilities for our past generations intact, really speaking to the reality that our responsibility to our past and older generation was kind of an intrinsic part of being, of our being and our imagination of the future. So there was kind of this push and pull of our imagination of the future being wider than what we were used to, and our ability to reimagine and kind of reset the agenda. But even within that, there was definitely kind of this necessity to keep our older generations in mind and to do right in their perspective, I think. Natsuha, do you want to continue on with maybe our next topic? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Moya.
Right. If I might actually interject, because that was
Please.
super rich, and I know you have some other topics that you want to share. But one thing maybe to highlight for our listeners is, again, this curious relationship to the past that we sort of keep bringing up. We can't not think about the future without thinking about the past. And it doesn't make sense to like throw the past away when we're thinking about the future. Maybe not, because actually we need to draw inspiration from somewhere to frame the way that we think about the future. And it tends to come from either the past or the present. But it does seem like being able to know that we have this choice of where we choose our sources of inspiration for the images of the future come from is in itself like liberating, empowering, but also just offers more possibility space. And I know you tie this to peace building agendas in the context of Japan, but it could be a general, or to abstract it, a general principle that we can all take into different areas of work that we have. So the question really becomes, how do we honor the past while being forward thinking, right? Future thinking. But passing it back to you. And please, if you want to react to it as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sally. I think I can build on what you just shared as well. So on the topic of burden and power, I would also like to share about direction for the dialogue with a purpose ahead and systematic process. So dialogue needs a purpose and direction to answer the question of why are we having this dialogue, because there should be always a clear purpose. But this direction can become vague in peace-building dialogues, as we have experienced, perhaps because there's so much about the past that needs to be faced in Northeast Asian context, as we have shared. And often the purpose of dialogue becomes having the dialogue itself for relationship building and mutual understanding and trust building. So by no means I want to say like these are not important. These are like super, super important. But as historical conflict is a big challenge in the context of Northeast Asia, dialogue often connects to sharing past grievances and current issues relating to continued grievances, but not so much often about the futures or the way to move forward. So it is a big part of building a culture and environment of trust, as we seem to have been emphasizing, but between people in Northeast Asia, and thus creating the starting point of the dialogue. But often it is challenging to know where to take the dialogue beyond this and to guide collective thinking towards future visions and solutions. So even though we are trying to walk towards the future, we are still kind of captivated by the past. So this is why it was so refreshing in the Futures Literacy experience, while also a little bit unsettling to be able to start with already being in the future. So it was, like we mentioned earlier, a somewhat liberating environment where we were given the space to ideate and relate with each other from a different starting point, because we were already in the future when talking about futures. Yeah, Moya, would you like to continue?
Yeah, thanks, Natsuha. So I feel like through this dialogue and this futures literacy process that we were going through, there was always the push and pull of the future and the past, and having direction towards something, but also wanting to settle down a little more and sit in the space to maybe get to know each other, to understand our positionalities and kind of the context of each other's countries a little bit more, which I think importantly contributed to the sense of discomfort that we had, and discomfort in maybe a positive sense, right? So I kind of want to speak to that. So as I mentioned earlier, we came up with a lot of different considerations through our dialogues. Some of them touched on topics like the role of collective memory in the future. Others touched on like elder care or the role of education, some of the things that we've been sharing so far. But while there are many ideas of the future and how it might look like, there is definitely a desire to further understand the nuances of why these ideas were important to each of us and each of the participants, but also together as a collective. So in other words, I think what we wanted to do was to further ground our ideas to our individual and collective realities. So not necessarily the inability, but perhaps the lack of being able to do that was lack of the level that we were able to do that, I guess, came out as a feeling of discomfort. And a discomfort that what we had ideated still felt somewhat far away once we returned to the present after ideating. And there were two things that came to my mind when thinking about how we might better ground our images and kind of answer to that discomfort that we felt. We've been talking and kind of touching on this throughout our discussion, but one was to better understand our own and each other's positionalities, like Natsuha mentioned earlier. And these things did happen throughout the discussion. So a good example is one of our participants who ideated from her perspective was a British individual, but someone that grew up all of her life, her childhood, and her kind of early adult life in Japan. So her images of the future resonated with her positionality, and she was always able to express this to fellow participants. So when she shared about the future, she kind of spoke from this identity that she had. And so participants also knew where she came from, right? Where her perspectives came from. So her insights were often kind of countered with questions about, oh, can you tell me a little bit more about that? What experience inspired you to say that? Which was this wonderful energy and this kind of connecting of the discomfort that maybe we felt with some other comments that the connections are a little bit more difficult to find. Another kind of aspect was our need to connect our images of the future to the past and also the present. So this was perhaps especially felt as a necessity because our topic was centered around peace. We wanted to better understand how our images of the future of peace spoke to the peace issues of the present and the past. And we wanted to make sure that our images were not just a sort of utopia or a dystopia. It was interesting because the participants that were experts on the region's politics, on the region's security issues, found it somewhat easier to speak on the topic of Northeast Asian peace, connecting their knowledge and expertise of the region and of the region's past and present to their images of the future. But for those who had other expertise or experiences that were maybe difficult to connect or not as easy to connect, I felt we needed to have an extra step of discussing how are you or your experience, your knowledge, how is that relevant to this topic that we're talking about? And so we thought that in that sense, when we were able to connect that positionality to the topic that we were talking about, it really flowed and the questions really came easily. But when we still had that one step to go of ourselves coming to the realization of how our experience is really related to the topic, it became a little bit more difficult. And the ideas that came out became a little more perhaps generalist or maybe not as grounded, using the word that I used earlier. So this discomfort we felt when we weren't quite sure how to ground our images of the future birthed a sense of frustration and discomfort. But it was interesting that a lot of the participants, at least in my group, shared this kind of hunger to be able to answer to this frustration that they had. And that was actually quite encouraging for me, because I felt like they were going to really continue on answering to this. There's actually kind of this pedagogical process that I find really interesting in peace education, where we talk about creating environments where we can face discomfort and really questioning what this discomfort is, where it comes from, and that being the energy to create better changes in our surroundings. And this kind of sense of discomfort is something that perhaps myself and Natsuha continue with, which actually leads us to the discussion where we want to share about what we want to do, incorporating futures literacy in each of our works. But that's kind of some of the topics that we really dove into when thinking about how to incorporate futures literacy. Yeah.
Super fascinating. And actually this raises a question for me as well, which is, well, first that, to know yourself is probably the hardest thing ever. I'm not sure anyone has truly or can precisely delineate, exactly who they are. In a way, in doing so, also noting that we might be changing all the time also. And really, this is quite the meta question about the FL process, is that is it okay for us to know certain things about ourselves and to be able to share it, to negotiate that shared meaning with others, such as, the word peace might be used differently by someone who is in the field of peace building or familiar with this topic versus those who are not. It can mean different for someone in the everyday sense, but also as they are going through this process of learning about others, to simultaneously take this journey of learning about themselves, right? Because in order to define a position, they need to know themselves. And if we don't know ourselves completely, is it all right that we, simultaneously have a dialogue and to define that ourselves? So a very, very meta question that you raised for me. And I don't have the answer to this necessarily, but maybe you have a few thoughts, but also invite you to feel free to continue with your own question on implementing FL in your own work.
So I guess this next part, at least for me, is going to be a lot more questions than answers. But yeah, so thinking about how can we incorporate FL to be a more sustainable part of peace building processes, I think is what I was considering. So Natsuha and I were kind of thinking about how we can incorporate FL into our regional dialogues that we've been facilitating. And when we thought about this, we came with the question that Natsuha also shared earlier of what would it mean to introduce this capability to people who already kind of knew each other and had gone through the process of sharing their past conflicts and sharing how they viewed peace and how they viewed Northeast Asia, how they viewed kind of our relationship to each other as people who share a historical conflict that still kind of lives on today. Undoubtedly, working off of that energy of people who have met for the first time brings a lot of insight that allows us to kind of look into things that we cannot plan for. But we also thought, given the amount of energy that it takes to position ourselves when it comes to Northeast Asian peace building, we thought it would also be an interesting thing to introduce FL to people who have already spent several months kind of doing the work of getting to know each other, of already speaking about what are the regional conflicts and the current day peace and conflict issues. So we were wondering, maybe we could build a capability of people who develop dual capabilities of reconciling the past with the future, and the ability to deconstruct words like peace and unity, but maintaining the gravity of the past. So kind of trying to explain what I just said, I guess, because a big part of the discomfort that we felt during the FL was that we had all of these ideas, but there was a sense of utopia because we didn't have the time during that project perhaps to really ground it and to appreciate the gravity of what we were trying to do within the context of Northeast Asia and peace building. That is not to kind of devalue what we did, but also kind of seeing the potential of what it can be. It would be really exciting to try this out with a group of people who have done the work of positioning ourselves within a group, right? So understandably, futures literacy methodologies have the space within itself for practitioners to reconcile the past with the future. But I think it is also important to speak to the challenge and energy itself that it takes of positioning, and also maybe respecting, I don't know. So this is the question, right? This is the big meta question that Natsuha also brought up of, can we think about the future while still figuring out ourselves? And I think ultimately the answer is yes, but also I think it's important to understand and respect the process of each part of thinking about the future, but also kind of facing our past, and making sure that we don't take it lightly, right? The difficulty of both. So kind of connecting this with a thing that I've been studying. I don't know if it actually connects now that I'm talking about it, but in memory studies, which is one of my fascinations, we say that in building a nation's or community's memory or collective memory, there's always a meta memory. So an understanding that collective memory is developed and formed to meet the social needs and frameworks of our time. But also collective memory is used to guide people toward a certain future in light of how we understand the past. And over history, this kind of meta memory is often decided by those in power so that they can tailor the past to suit the present and also the anticipated needs of the powerful. So when the powerful have the ability, when those in power have the ability to tailor the past, it can inform how we should understand the present, kind of maneuvering us to be a certain people in the future, which will hopefully be a people that will kind of serve the needs of those in power, right? So as citizens, it's really paramount, and I guess as peace builders, paramount that we understand how we've been taught to understand the histories and the memories, our collective memories. And the work that we have tried to further through our regional dialogue, myself and Natsuha, is to critically reflect on the past, its social injustices, and how our past is being taught to us, to reveal how these structures of injustice and violence came about and still continue. But now that we have been trained in futures literacy capabilities, I'm kind of excited to start introducing how this critical understanding of our past and present can also be fed into a grounded and empathetic process of envisioning futures that can reconcile with the past. And so kind of hoping to continue building this dual capability, I think, of looking at the past and the future and reconciling those two things in the present. So lots of questions, but yes, let me pass to maybe Sally before we go to Natsuha, or yeah, up to you, Sally.
Thanks, Moy. That's super lovely. Just wanted to point out a few things from what you said when you mentioned, what if we took, an FL process and did it with a group of people who already knew each other for 4 months. I think for me, this all comes back to co-design, which you were part of. This is super important to co-design for every single group that you're doing an FL process with, because in the questions we ask, the way we frame a topic needs to speak to that particular group. And if they already knew each other, they're going to have this sense of trust with each other, just by nature of being familiar with each other, that a group of like the group of young people that we had who had to send in applications, who were selected to participate, who didn't know each other from before, they have that trust that they wouldn't have. And so this sort of comes back around on this. Every single process needs to be co-designed, carefully tailored to them. So actually, it would be super interesting to see how they would approach this. To use an analogy, it's like not only, to navigate waters, you not only know how to swim across the river, but you know now how to build a boat to also row across the river. Is just knowing different ways of thinking about a topic, right, offers you different paradigms. So that's super interesting, and we'll love to see how it goes. And the other thing that you mentioned around, how do you look to the future while thinking in the past? And this in itself, we sort of come full circle to a question I think we asked earlier, is just, how do you look to the future while thinking about the past or honoring the past? What does it look like? So I actually want to pass it off to Natsuha to share her thoughts as well.
Thank you, Sally, and also Moe. Listening to you both, I'm also very excited about applying this futures literacy into more peace building dialogues in the context of Northeast Asia and beyond. And I would also like to share something about education as well, because I'm always thinking about this from educational perspective too. And so if I imagine how we could bring futures literacy into education in general, whatever the topic is, I imagine incorporating futures literacy as interdisciplinary practice across different subjects or themes would have a big impact. But imagining the impact of incorporating futures literacy in education, especially focusing on peace building, I think futures literacy can be an inspirational tool to change the way of thinking about the peace in education. So what I think is that it can inspire the shift from education about what peace is, and perhaps what war is or was, and into education for building peace together, recreating the narrative together to face and tackle the current issues, interpersonal, transnational relationships, or perhaps social justice, social injustice and inequity. So especially in the Northeast Asian context, the primary way of teaching uses the traditional banking approach, which is a teacher-centered method of teaching and learning, where the students receive and store the knowledge delivered to them by the teacher mainly. And as a student who grew up in Northeast Asian context, specifically Japanese context, I haven't been asked to imagine the future, but only learned what was happening in the past and is happening currently in the present as the facts. So as a teacher who has completed teacher education, also there were not many opportunities where we teachers learn to let students imagine creatively about the futures either. So having opportunities using futures literacy to use imagination and creativity to engage in collaborative processes of discussing the futures would be helpful for students learning in a sense of collaborative learning and developing critical thinking as well. And this process is also a student-centered way of learning, and it empowers students and youth in creating futures together. In futures literacy, being able to hear what youth are interested in discussing without imposing our agenda as a teacher was an inspiration. And we could build futures based on what participants bring to the conversations. And this mindset and system in futures literacy can inspire teaching to take the students' backgrounds, experiences, knowledge, ideas, and assumptions as a learning asset, and varying more what the student is interested in and places value in that to build classes and courses based on them too. So like we reflected on the ideas the participants initially had, then connected the ideas and discovered more questions, this reframing process of futures literacy can help the students find the differences and commonalities in the different ideas between oneself and others, and between groups or within oneself, and find questions that are more refined and on point. So these questions can help set the direction and purpose of the learning processes too. So I would emphasize that important thing is that these questions come from the students or participants' perspectives. So in my perspective, futures literacy can help build education that is more participatory, first of all, and creative, collaborative, and transformative based on participatory practices, and education in which a certain knowledge is not a necessity. While a specific knowledge helps deepen understandings, of course, but it doesn't help ideation. So you don't need to have a certain knowledge to participate in the dialogue. And I would imagine that participants or students have less fear of being wrong, as there is no right or wrong answer in thinking about the futures in general. And education that can be more inclusive and currently relevant about whose piece we consider. So it can be very student-centered way of learning too. And to add on to that, futures literacy can be also used as, I imagine, a tool to find questions that are important and meaningful for the participants, a particular group in a particular context at the time. And as a lot of questions emerge after the reframed scenario, it could also be a tool to redefine the concept of piece together and create a new narrative that is relevant to the current situation and the current participants. Yeah, so I'm really excited about diving into this more and further, and also practice as a facilitator and a co-designer as well.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for sharing all these incredibly rich thoughts. My mind goes back to the term rich because there's so much to unpack and not enough in only an hour and 30 minutes on a webinar. So really pleased and also excited to take these conversations offline to continue them. And that's why I love the way that you integrate it into the way that you will be thinking about teaching. Maybe this is my moment to make a small plug. We have about 30 plus UNESCO chairs in Futures Literacy, Future Studies, and Anticipation. And so depending on your topic of interest, it could be really neat to share with you some of the work that they are doing, and also for our audience as well. Those, of course, are programs being built specifically to advance future studies, but also really interesting to see how FL itself transforms the education process. And so infusing it in a way that on the meta level changes the conditions of change, if you will, if we see education as a process where young people can feel inspired and to share. I want to note that we do have some questions from the audience, and we're about 8 minutes to 6:30. If folks are okay with staying just a few minutes past, we'd love to be able to dive into some of these. So fielding one of them, Tomoe and Natsuha, would you say that it's only a matter of reconciling past and future, or from the past, even a collectively remembered past, that we can gain some seeds or some inspiration for the future that are potentially positive or potentially disruptive and totally new, positive or not? This question asker is thinking about possible unexpressed desires, hopes, values which could seed new future scenarios?
Thank you so much for this really interesting question. I think a lot of the work that goes into looking at memory and history is kind of doing exactly what you've mentioned here of understanding what are the unexpressed desires and hopes and values that people have. What are the ones that have not been expressed in the kind of mainstream narrative that we are often identified with. And so the work, I think, that goes into understanding our past and our memory is to really critically assess what it means to have that past as part of our identity, and to understand who came up with this past. Is it true to who we actually identify as? And if there are different understandings of the past, then why are they different, right? When we're thinking about, for example, talking between a Japanese person and a Chinese person. And oftentimes when we start to really unravel those understandings of our past, we get to a more truthful set of memories, or maybe more diverse sets of memories that are not in the mainstream, which often become a more fruitful source of thinking about the future. I think there's always a process of selection when we think about collective memories, and especially when it comes to majority memories. And so that can also limit how we source our thinking of the future, right? So a lot of the work that goes into, I think, deconstructing the way we understand about the past can really also speak to maybe what you're referring to, of really sourcing a rich understanding of what the future can be, and be inspiration toward that. Yeah, I wish I could give a concrete example to this. I'll mention it if I can think of something, but I'm sure there's many, but I will share it when I remember.
Thanks, Moy. Maybe I can give a very simple analogy, right? Just it becomes as simple as I will have friends over for dinner and I'm going to cook them some recipe. If I only go about knowing recipes that I know in the past, so cooking a particular dish with fish, then I'm only going to make all my decisions based on that fish. But if I'm understanding that, deconstructing that fish recipes aren't the only recipes, that there are many possibilities that exist, and being open to that future, being open to what comes up and might change, maybe I'm also shopping for other ingredients. So very simplistic example, but perhaps scaled across different disciplines, topics, when it comes to things like peace building, when it comes to policy decisions, having that possibility space and expanding the possibility space becomes very, very important. Natsuha, over to you.
I love your explanation and example, Sally. But I feel like Moe already expressed my thoughts as well. But then just to add on to that, I was thinking, this is a really good question, and I also have to think further. But I was thinking, like, through the futures literacy and the futures dialogue process, these usually unexpressed desires and hopes may become visible and noticeable as well. So I find that process really interesting. And then, as Sally also mentioned, it really depends on the context. It depends on the group of people at the time too. Even if you do this process with the same group of people, I think the outcomes or emerged questions would be very different next time too. So I feel like as we go through these processes, different kind of hopes and values and assumptions and maybe desires as well will come up, and we'll probably just try to see that as we go.
Thanks both. Yeah, catering to context, totally. Something that I think has been emphasized throughout this webinar as being something that's very important and we need to be paying attention to. Another question from the audience is, was there a negative or positive sense of the anticipated future? And I'm not sure whether this question speaks to one specific one or all of them. Perhaps Moe and Natsuha, you can speak to the difference of what you heard between the probable, preferred, and reframed futures. Like what sort of changed between the three when you were guiding participants?
Trying to re-jog my memory. I think one, thinking about the probable future, I think it really depended on the group of participants in each of our groups that we had. My group of people were quite positive in the sense that their probable futures that they imagined were not too far away from the preferred. And so apart from one participant, which was interesting, apart from one participant who was the regional kind of specialist on political issues of the region, which was that person's kind of work that they did on the daily. So their probable futures were, in a sense, very realistic, as I guess it should be, but also not as, not as in quote unquote like positive in that perspective. So that was interesting. But once we did the reframe, the images that we came up were a lot more positive in the sense that there was more hope, and there was a different kind of energy that participants came in with, speaking in the reframe future, and even in some of the analysis that we did, we found that participants kind of looked at the future from a different perspective as they thought about it. So that was an interesting change that we saw, or a shift that we saw in the participants' approach to thinking about the future itself. I don't know, Natsuha, would you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I relate to what you just shared, Moe. Also, what I have seen, somehow the probable and preferred futures were quite similar in a sense. But then if I can speak about the differences between those two, then maybe, so for the preferred futures, they were more ideal, and, you know, of course it's because it's preferred futures, but ideal ideas about the futures were there. But then for the probable futures, there was this contrast and gap between more conflicts, increased conflicts, and more cooperation. So there was a contrast between these two ideas. So some were hopeful about the probable future, some were a little bit pessimistic about the probable futures as well at the same time. And after the reframed scenario, I would say questions that emerged from that scenarios were more refined, in a sense that we were questioning, for example, like, what does it mean to have a regional identity? Does it even exist? Is there a boundary in this? And what does it mean to have national and regional identity at the same time? And all these questions really clarified what kind of things we are interested in and we want to delve into further. So yeah, that was interesting.
Thank you. Using sort of the FL process as a way to be reflective about our values and what's most important to us, and throughout the process realizing it is what I'm hearing. So super interesting. And Moe, to what you said about the participants sharing around their probable futures, and maybe they were more optimistic because they were not as well versed or was engaging, with issues on the day-to-day, sort of challenge the assumption that we might make that we assume the worst when we don't know something. It sounds like this group is expressing their desire and hopes in a way and trying to link it to their desired futures. So that's also something that quite interesting to hear. One more question for all of you, for both of you. What are some strange and bizarre futures that the participants came up with, and what did they learn from them? What were some anticipatory assumptions that the participants had? So I will contextualize the reframe scenario and then pass it on to Moe and Natsuha to maybe highlight one or two. It might be helpful for the both of you to think back to the summaries that we had for Futures Dialogue 2 that we shared at the beginning of Futures Dialogue 3. As mentioned before, the reframe, we introduced this based on what participants shared in their probable and preferred, intentionally so, to disassociate them from any sort of anticipatory assumptions, any frames of references that they currently had, to push them into a very strange space, a bizarre space of that future. They might not like it. It might not be realistic or probable, and it's not the intention. It's just for it to be strange in order to put them in a very different possibility space and then see what they can invent and come up with, in a way pushing them to be creative. And so the scenario that we introduced was, first, young people had to, not young people, but each generation, each Northeast Asian generation was responsible for future generations. This didn't mean whether or not they were still responsible to the past or not. This is something for them to decide, but it was made explicit that they were responsible for future generations. And the way we defined generationality was purpose-based, and they needed to construct and negotiate what the roles of the generations look like. The other parameter was climate change as a constant. And so in probable and preferred, we heard desires that, climate change will be resolved, and we wanted to put this forward to them as a point of continuity, and to see how they engaged with it. So passing it now over to Moe and Natsuha, what were some of the things that participants came up with?
Some of the bizarre futures that the participants came up with, especially after the reframe, was really playing on the concept of what does it mean to have more allegiance to the new generations. And some of it kind of questioned our concept of knowledge and where knowledge is sourced, if not from if we have allegiance to newer generations, then would we have a knowledge source that is more serendipitous or more reaction-based instead of based on tried and tested old knowledge, in a sense, which was a really interesting concept that we kind of built on. Another participant happened to also be studying collective memory, and so she wondered what the role of collective memory would have in this reframe future. Would we base our identity of our region on something else other than what we had built up on? So really kind of questioning some of the foundational aspects of our identity as people of the region, and also questioning how we make decisions in the future based on our perspectives of knowledge, which was quite interesting for us. We also kind of worked on ideas of how we saw the role of the government, especially when we thought about our young people's roles in the future. What was actually interesting was that we didn't go, at least in my group, we didn't go too far away from kind of a traditional perspective of what the government's role might be. We still saw the government playing kind of a critical role in making sure that, for example, the environment was protected, making sure that people had a role within it, which revealed, I guess, some assumptions that we had, that we still need a certain bigger power that will make sure and protect citizens. Maybe this would have been quite different if we worked with people from different regions, but there was, at least from some of our participants, the perspective that government having a role in the future was not a conflict for us as youth, even though we did see the government having being maybe slower to react and taking agency on some of the issues that we thought were important. So some friction, but also some comfort within that kind of role of the government. Yeah, which I thought was quite interesting, because I thought perhaps we would kind of completely upheave the role of the government and like power relations and so on, but that was not necessarily the case for our young people. Natsuha, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Moe. So from my group of participants, I could also share that after the reframe scenario of shifting the responsibility towards the elders into the responsibilities towards the future generations. So we started to question, how do we define the elders, or how do we define the young or youth? And who are the past generations in 2060 if we are responsible for future generations, and who are who, basically. So we talked about also inequalities, maybe in this context, who will be left out, and meaning of privilege, and also prejudices and biases across groups and generations. And we also talked about, in addition to the definition of youth and young and elders, if the youth is protected by older generations or current generations who are living now, then when do responsibility towards future generation begin? And we also talked about protection mechanism. Who needs to be protected? And is there any vulnerable generation? And what does it mean to be vulnerable in this 2060 that we are reframing and imagining? So yeah, I thought that was worth sharing. And yeah, I found it very interesting to think about these questions that are refined in reframed scenarios.
Thank you, Mo and Natsuha, not only for this question, but this entire webinar. Gosh, we can just go on forever, actually. But sort of just like as we do sometimes in labs, where you run out of time and even run over time by a little bit. So thank you to our audience who stuck around and staying on for the extra bit of time. Moe, Natsuha, thank you again. It is so incredible to hear this deeper reflection from the both of you on experiencing and learning FL, the dual role as learners and facilitators, and also your desire and how you wish to take FL forward and apply it to different areas of peace building or education and in the work that you're doing. For folks who are with us, feel free to get in touch at Futures with an S at UNESCO.org. If you have any other questions or comments, feel free to also get connected directly with Moe and Natsuha, as they're just doing such incredibly cool work in the respective areas. Thank you all again for joining us for the Transforming Future webinar. And I invite you to also keep an eye out for future episodes as we bring forth more diverse voices to talk about futures and futures literacy. Thank you both. Thank you all. Have a lovely rest of your evening.